You alright, folks, and welcome back. The Deadmines. In Cataclysm, this iconic five-man finds itself the subject of a minor facelift and is one of only two vanilla instances that finds itself part of a heroic roster this expansion. So, without further ado, let's dive straight into what you can expect from this dungeon over the next few months. And as before in my Blackrock Caverns video, and as will be the case going forward, I'll only touch on the bosses and certain mobs that you may have trouble with. There is really no need to go over every single pack blow by blow, because in a lot of cases your tank will just pull them and you'll kill them and you won't ever notice that they did anything to you. First things then, you're going to run into a few ogres, namely one on a cannon. Now this cannon can in fact be used against your enemies in this dungeon, and you might actually want to utilise it early on because the aforementioned ogres hurt quite a bit. In fact, in numbers, they might even chunk your tank down significantly early on. They have two abilities. You've got Uppercut, which inflicts 200% weapon damage and knocks its target down, and then there's Ogrish Motivation. Until this point, I really didn't realise that was even a word, but I digress. This decreases the time between melee attacks by 100%. Essentially, they're locking melee out of attacking while simultaneously giving your tank a concussion. In testing, we opted to kill the initial Cannoneer Ogre, then pull any packs between us and the first boss back into the cannon's line of sight and blow them to Kingdom Come. This was especially useful with the Ogre bodyguards who, like the other ogres you've been fighting up to this point, suck if you are a tank. After that, you'll move on to the first boss, Glubtok. Now in testing, there were a couple of things missing from his toolkit, but even with them included, this fight only really has one mechanic that'll kill you. So, stage 1, you've got Fists of Flame and Frost. Most of the time, they will do unnoticeable amounts of damage, but on occasion, they can do about 20k to all nearby players, along with a unique additional effect, depending on the school of magic. Fire will knock everyone 5 yards in the air, and Frost will reduce movement speed and attack speeds, which is, pretty standard Frost magic shenanigans. In this phase, when either of those two buffs wear off, he will blink to a random member of the group and drop all threat. So if he does this and lands on you just as you get an ability off, you might get bitch slapped, but it's highly unlikely. Phase 2 at 50%, he'll TP to the middle of the boss room and start flinging fire and frost blossoms all over the place. These are projectiles that will be clearly marked on the floor, just don't stand in them. If you do, you'll suffer similar effects to the Fists of Fire and Frost from earlier, but with half the damage. Now on Heroic, once these blossoms land and explode, they should then spawn an ad of the corresponding elemental type. However, in testing, they weren't showing up, and even if they do, they aren't that impressive. They've got very low health, and the most basic of AoE should clear them from the board in a jiffy. Then his final ability, and the thing that will kill you. Firewall. During this phase, Glubtok summons a constantly moving wall of flame that will persist for the rest of the fight until he is dead. You will need to move with this wall, because even in the 359 gear we had on the beta, it will barbecue you. Healers will rightly refuse to heal the Muppets who elect to stand in this fire. It's an absurd amount of damage, but it is also really easily avoided. After Glubtok, you'll enter the tunnel with all the monkeys. Now, these monkeys are absolute buggers. If you aggro them, they'll just stand at range and throw bananas at you, which does a serious amount of damage, especially if you aggro a load of them and they're all just hammering away at you. Luckily, all you need to do is click on the ball and chains near them and they stop. The Goblin ads in this region also suck a fair bit. The Overseers have an ability called Motivate. This ability increases the target's movement speed by 50%, but does a fair amount of shadow damage at the same time. If you have multiple of these mobs casting it, it's likely, if it's landing on the same target, they will die. Now, you can interrupt this, and you should aim to do that at all times. But you pair this with the monkeys constantly abusing you from afar, you will quickly come to realise that this area is not to be taken lightly. At the end of the tunnel, you will reach the mast room where you're greeted by a load of oath lackeys. They're very similar to the ogres at the start, few in number, but are singularly more tough, and essentially, you're meant to take these one, maybe two at a time at a push. Higher gear, maybe more, but at appropriate levels of gear and whatnot, you might get squished if you get over eager. Once you've dealt with them, you've got Helix Gearbreaker, boss number 2. In phase 1, you've got the OP sat on, and during this phase there are 4 things you're going to want to watch out for. Throughout the encounter, there will be 4 goblins above you throwing bombs onto the floor of the boss room. Just avoid them, it's pretty simple. The Oaf himself will, throughout the fight, do Oaf Smash. He'll pick up a random player and charge them into a wooden log on the other side of the room. Now, this should be the ability you keep your eye out for, because it should, on Heroic, inflict 100% of the player's health in physical damage. In theory, you should have a cooldown or something like that on hand to prevent the smashed player being turned into a fine veneer on the dungeon's walls. In testing, it didn't seem to do an iota of damage, and that's not just because of the 359 gear available. I've seen more appropriately geared characters tank this hit, and their health bars didn't even so much as flinch. The Oaf will also throw Helix at random players throughout phase 1. Helix will attach himself to that player's face and just punch away. After about 10 seconds, he leaps back onto the Oaf, leaving behind a chest bomb that will do a shit ton of damage to anyone within 6 yards, and blasting that target high into the sky. To avoid death by fall damage, stand under the beam in the middle of the room and you'll be grand. I mean, you'll have a headache, but you'll be grand. Phase 2 is when the Oaf dies and Helix is left on his own. During this part, all the abilities Helix had in phase 1 carry over, including the chest bombs, but Helix himself is made of wet paper towels and should just go down without a hitch. The Oaf is meant to be the real fight here. After this, you've got the tunnel leading down to the foundry. You'll come across some Defias mobs, most of which are just copy-pasted from the original vanilla instance. However, the Invoker mob is one to look out for. Basically interrupt anything they cast and focus them down. They'll have Invoker's Shield, which renders CC completely pointless, but they've also got Renegade Strength, which makes the target of the spell take reduced damage from AoE sources by 90%. It also increases that mob's health by 300% and their physical damage by 200%. They can actually cast this spell on other invokers, which seems a bit pointless because they're caster mobs, but if it goes on an overseer, it might hurt a little. Foundry's next, and in vanilla this place was crawling with goblins, not so anymore. You'll notice as you enter this area a prototype Reaper at the top of the ramp. This mob will be very important for the boss fight itself, but you can also use it to batter the mobs in between if you so wish. Those mobs being Defias Reapers, those annoying scarecrows you'll have spent many an hour punching in Westfall at one point or another. Just take them one at a time when you're grand. What is cool though is at 30% the Reapers catch fire and players can jump into these Reapers and gain access to similar abilities as the prototype Reaper you'll use in the boss fight. However, since the Reapers are on fire, they quickly lose that last 30% of HP passively, so you'll use them on the next mob for a little bit, but that's about it. The boss then, Foe Reaper 5000. Got a few abilities and tricks up his sleeve that'll mince the AFK player, but so long as you pay attention, you'll be grand. First up is Reaper Strike. It's a fancy cleave. The boss deals physical damage to all targets within 10 yards in a frontal cone, so simply put, tanks face him away from the group, everyone else, particularly the melee, stick to his ass. Then you've got Overdrive. This is Bladestorm by another name. The boss will do a 10-second AoE, after the first 2 seconds of which he starts running around the room at double his normal speed. So just be on your toes and avoid the slicey dicey robot thing. He also does Harvest. It's a focused charge of sorts. He'll set his eyes on a player and make a beeline for him. But as he does this, he'll still be doing his frontal attack, and once he reaches his destination, he'll do Harvest Sweep, which will knock back anyone it hits and deal a truckload of damage. If you see him running at you, just run away. That's the best thing you can do. At 30%, his safety restrictions go offline. This is just the boss's enrage. For the remainder of the fight, he'll do 100% increased damage, plain and simple. Now, I mentioned that prototype Reaper. Where does it come into play for the encounter? Well, throughout the fight, the boss will summon Molten Slag. These fire elemental lads will fixate a random player and do a constant pulsing fire AoE, which hurts a lot. You can't really tank them, especially not in numbers, but the Reaper is immune to fire. So you use its abilities, namely Reaper Strike to deal damage, which is a less powerful version of the bosses, which also builds steam power. You then use that power on Reaper Charge, which is fairly self-explanatory, and Pressurized Strike, which knocks the molten slags about and keeps them away from their fixated target, though sometimes they do fixate on the Reaper, which makes life a little easier. So as long as the player in the Reaper can control the ads, the rest of the fight should go off with minimal issue. Onto the final tunnel then. More Defiers, most of which just do varying degrees of physical damage. You've got Bloodbath from the Enforcers, just don't be near them when they're doing that, it'll hurt. The real treat here is actually the Blood Mages. They can pop down a Rage Zone, which is a red bubble of sorts. Anyone standing within this bubble, be they NPC or player, will do 50% increased damage. What you should do is use this to your advantage. When the Blood Mage puts it up, have the tank shuffle the ads out of it whilst your DPSers stand in and batter the packs to death. If you have a pack with multiple Blood Mages and they cast multiple Rage Zones, if you can get them to overlap, you can also get the buff to stack. Now we're in the final section, the Ironclad Cove. Big ass boat, lots of pirates, and some poxy parrots. Honestly, there isn't anything interesting to say here regarding any of the mobs up to the last couple of bosses. Only that whilst you're running up to the boat, you'll have to navigate a cannon gauntlet. Should you survive this and get on the boat, you can then use those same cannons on the ads on the ship, similarly to the start of the instance with the ogres and whatnot. Well, this leads us on to the most annoying boss of the roster, Admiral Ripsnarl. There's nothing overly dangerous about Ripsnarl post-nerf. He's got Thirst for Blood, which is a stacking buff that lasts for 10 seconds every time he gets a successful melee hit off, but it's really not likely to scare your tank in any way. You've then got Swipe, which is just Cleave renamed. It hits the tank and the two nearest targets in melee range for a portion of the damage, and Go for the Throat. Throughout the fight, he'll jump on a target, dealing 100% of a standard melee attack's damage and stunning them for a couple of seconds. Again, hardly noticeable in this post-nerf state. Then you got Fog. It's the gimmick of the encounter. Every 25% of the boss's health, he vanishes into some thick fog for a while, and instead has fog vapors appear to annoy the players. I'll put their abilities on screen now, but they are really not worth going over in depth, as frankly they last about as long as a virgin in a whorehouse. They have no health to speak of and will very quickly fall over. After a little while, the boss reappears from the fog, and you repeat this process until dead. The quote-unquote final boss is next, Captain Cookie. It's a bit of a disappointing fight, to be honest. He does nothing. He just throws food out of a cauldron. Now, there are two types of food, good food and rotten food. DPSers and healers should eat the good food, as it's heroism by a different name. It increases casting and attack speed by 30%. Tanks, however, should run around eating the rotten food. Doing so will put a stack in debuff on the tanks, doing a bit of damage, but it will also stop the rotting food pulsing its AoE aura. And since the boss does sweet bugger all apart from throw the pantry at you, there isn't anything else for the healer to worry about, so as long as they can keep the tank up, it's grand. Should, however, the dot prove too much, you can eat some of the good food, as it will remove one stack of the nausea debuff. And that's the dungeon. Bit crappy at the end, but it is what it is. Oh wait, no it's not. Vanessa Van Cleef, the best boss in this dungeon and one of the best in Cataclysm in my opinion. Once the encounter starts, you'll be poisoned and you'll have to run a gauntlet of the previous boss's worst nightmares. First, it's Glubtok. You'll find your party being lowered into the Goblin Foundry. To break free, you need to click on the steam valves clearly indicated on your screen, and then you'll be dropped to the top of the ramp, because the first part of the gauntlet is about navigating through some very nasty fire. If you run off immediately before it's spawned and you've been healed up, you may very well die. When you get to the bottom, you'll face Glubtok again, but no fancy tricks this time, just a target dummy that moves. Once he dies, Helix spawns in his place, and in lieu of the fire, now stand a hell of a lot of spiders. You've got to kill Helix before you're overwhelmed by said spiders. Afterwards, you enter the Foe Reaper's nightmare with a gauntlet of lightning walls that you need to avoid. If they touch you, you die. Get to the end, kill Foe Reaper, move on. And the final one you've got to do is the Admiral's Nightmare. You have to save his family before they get murdered by the Worgen. You gotta be quick here. Should you fail to save even one of his relatives, it's game over. You get to the top of the ship, you kill Ripsnarl, and that's the Nightmare run done. Now is the fun bit where you get to kill Van Cleef. She's a bitch in all the best possible ways. So, abilities then. Deflection. For 10 seconds, she deflects all attacks. This is only cast while she's above 25% HP. Then you got Deadly Blades. It's basically Blade Flurry. She jumps from player to player using the ability Backslash. This is just backstab with a dot. It deals damage every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. And whilst above 50% HP, she will summon Defias Adds, the same ones you fought in the tunnel before the cove earlier. They even have the same abilities, but they do tend to die pretty quick, but just make sure to focus them down. At 50%, she does the first Fiery Blaze, where she sets the deck of the ship on fire with some big bombs. To avoid this, you need to click on some rope that conveniently appears on the edge of the deck. You need to time it though. If you jump on these ropes too early, you'll end up swinging straight back into the blaze and barbecuing yourself. You want to get it so you jump off pretty much as the explosives go off. After this, she'll start casting Vengeance of Van Cleef, a stacking buff she puts on herself that increases her physical damage by 4% and melee attack speed by 4%, stacking up to 40 times. The only way to interrupt this is to engage her in combat again. At 25% after the second Fiery Blaze, she'll just keep using this ability until the fight's over. At 1%, she opts to self-delete in a mighty explosion, taking us with her. To avoid this, just shuffle to the edge of the boat. If you're on top of it when it goes off, you will go boom. But that is the Deadmines. It's a cracking dungeon overall. Ripsnarl and Cookie are a couple of lame ducks as far as encounters go, but Vanessa is a bloody wicked fight and requires you to be on your toes throughout the entire thing. But if you let me know your thoughts down below, and be so kind as to like, sub, share with your pals and so on, that'd be grand. Have a good one, folks. Bye for now!